The story of a dog and a kind owner who have been together for 13 years. And then something unpleasant happened. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Margaret Sullivan sat at her small wooden table, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. Across from her, in a bed that had seen better days, lay her faithful companion of 13 years, a golden retriever named Bailey. Bailey's breathing was labored now, each exhale a small struggle that broke Margaret's heart a little more. The veterinarian's words from yesterday still echoed in her mind. "It's time, Margaret. He's suffering." But how could she let go of the one constant in her life for over a decade? How could she say goodbye to the soul who had seen her through her husband's death, her children moving away, and the long quiet years that followed? The beginning. Margaret remembered the day Bailey came into her life as clearly as if it were yesterday. It was a crisp October morning in 2011, just 3 months after Robert had passed. Her daughter Sarah had driven up from Boston, concerned about her mother living alone in the old farmhouse. "Mom, you need companionship." Sarah had insisted, steering their car into the parking lot of the local animal shelter. "Dad would want you to have someone to take care of." Margaret had protested, of course. At 67, she felt too old to train a puppy, too set in her ways to adjust to a new routine. But Sarah was persistent, and before Margaret knew it, they were walking through the rows of kennels, each occupied by a hopeful face. Then she saw him. In the last kennel on the left sat a golden retriever puppy no more than 8 weeks old. Unlike the other dogs who barked and jumped at the cage doors, this one sat quietly, his tail wagging gently, his deep brown eyes meeting Margaret's with an expression of such profound understanding that she felt her resistance crumble. "That one," she whispered, pointing to the puppy. The shelter volunteer, a young woman with kind eyes, smiled. "He's been here for 2 weeks. Found abandoned by the highway. No collar, no chip. He's very gentle, almost like an old soul in a puppy's body." When they opened the kennel, the puppy walked straight to Margaret and sat at her feet, looking up at her as if to say, "I've been waiting for you." Sarah had tears in her eyes. "Mom, I think he chose you." Margaret bent down, her arthritic knees protesting, and gathered the warm bundle of fur into her arms. He nestled against her chest with a contented sigh, and in that moment, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since Robert's death. "Hope. Bailey," she said softly. "I'll call you Bailey." The early years. The first few months were an adjustment for both of them. Bailey, despite his calm demeanor at the shelter, was still a puppy with boundless energy. Margaret's quiet routine of morning coffee, afternoon gardening, and evening reading was suddenly punctuated by walks, playtime, and the occasional accident on her Persian rug. But Bailey was a quick learner and seemed to sense Margaret's limitations. He never pulled too hard on the leash during their walks, always slowing his pace to match her shorter stride. When her arthritis flared up, he would lie quietly beside her chair, his warm presence more comforting than any heating pad. Their daily routine soon became sacred. Every morning at 6, Bailey would gently nudge Margaret awake with his nose. They'd have breakfast together, kibble for him, toast and jam for her, before setting out on their morning walk. The route never varied down the gravel driveway left onto Maple Street, past the Henderson farm, around the pond where the Canada geese gathered, and back home through the small woods behind the elementary school. In the afternoons, while Margaret tended her garden, Bailey would lie in the shade of the old oak tree, occasionally chasing a butterfly or barking at the squirrels who dared to raid the bird feeders. He had an uncanny ability to sense when Margaret had been kneeling too long. He'd trot over and gently bump her with his head, reminding her to take a break. Evenings were for the two of them. Margaret would settle into Robert's old recliner with a book, and Bailey would curl up on the rug at her feet. Sometimes she'd read aloud to him, Mysteries, mostly, occasionally a romance novel that made her blush. Bailey would listen with apparent interest, his tail thumping whenever she reached an exciting part. The seasons passed in comfortable rhythm. Spring brought muddy paws and the annual battle to keep Bailey from digging up the newly planted tulip bulbs. Summer meant long, lazy afternoons on the porch, Bailey panting in the heat, while Margaret sipped lemonade and watched the world go by. Fall was Bailey's favorite. He loved to leap into the pile of leaves Margaret raked, sending them flying in all directions while she laughed and scolded him half-heartedly. Winter transformed their walks into adventures, Bailey bounding through the snow like a polar bear, while Margaret picked her way carefully along the icy paths. The middle years. As Bailey matured from a rambunctious puppy into a dignified adult dog, their bond deepened. He seemed to develop an almost supernatural ability to sense Margaret's moods. On the anniversary of Robert's death, when Margaret would sit at the kitchen table looking at photo albums, Bailey would rest his head on her lap, his soulful eyes offering silent comfort. There was the time Margaret slipped on ice during their winter walk, twisting her ankle badly. Bailey had refused to leave her side, barking frantically until Tom Henderson heard him from his barn and came to help. The paramedics later told Margaret that Bailey had tried to follow the ambulance running behind it until Tom caught him and promised to bring him to the hospital. "That dog of yours is something special," the ER doctor had said, sneaking Bailey into Margaret's room against hospital policy. "Tom tells me he wouldn't eat or settle down until he could see you were okay." Margaret spent a week on crutches, and Bailey appointed himself her dedicated nurse. He'd fetch her slippers, carry the newspaper in his mouth, and position himself strategically so she could use him for support when standing. When the physical therapist came to the house, Bailey watched every exercise intently as if memorizing the routine. Their connection went beyond the typical pet-owner relationship. Margaret found herself talking to Bailey throughout the day, sharing her thoughts and memories. She told him about meeting Robert at a dance in 1965, about raising 3 children in the old farmhouse, about her dreams of traveling to Ireland that never materialized. Bailey would listen, his head tilted occasionally, offering a soft woof of understanding. Sometimes Margaret could swear he was responding to her stories, his tail wagging harder when she recounted happy memories, his body pressing closer when she spoke of losses and regrets. The mailman Jim often joked that Bailey knew the difference between bills and personal letters. "He always wags his tail when I've got something good," Jim would say, scratching Bailey behind the ears. And it was true. Bailey seemed to have a sixth sense about the mail, greeting Jim with enthusiasm on days when letters from Margaret's grandchildren arrived. Or the challenges. Life wasn't always easy. There was the summer Bailey developed a severe ear infection that required weeks of treatment and made him irritable and withdrawn. Margaret spent sleepless nights applying drops and comforting him when he whimpered in pain. The vet bills stretched her fixed income, but Margaret never hesitated. "He's family," she told her son Michael when he suggested the treatment was too expensive. Then there was the incident with the porcupine. Bailey, usually so sensible, had ventured too close during a walk in the woods. Margaret had to rush him to the emergency vet, his face full of quills, his eyes rolling in pain and fear. She held him while the vet removed each quill, whispering soothing words and promises of treats to come. No more chasing woodland creatures. She'd lectured him on the drive home, Bailey, looking suitably chastened in the back seat. But within a week he was back to his old tricks, though Margaret noticed he gave porcupines a wide berth from then on. As the years passed, they faced the inevitable challenges of aging together. Margaret's arthritis worsened, making their walks shorter and less frequent. Bailey adapted without complaint, seeming to understand that the distance mattered less than the companionship. Some days they'd only make it to the end of the driveway before Margaret needed to rest. Bailey would sit beside her, leaning against her legs, content just to be together. There were scares, too. The morning Margaret woke to find Bailey having a seizure remains etched in her memory. The frantic drive to the vet, Bailey's body rigid in the back seat. The agonizing wait while they ran tests. The relief when the vet diagnosed epilepsy, manageable with medication. Margaret became an expert at recognizing the warning signs, adjusting his medicine, keeping detailed logs of every episode. "You're quite the nurse," Dr. Patterson had commented during one of their many follow-up visits. "Bailey's lucky to have you." "We're lucky to have each other," Margaret corrected, running her hand along Bailey's golden coat. Acronaster, the golden years. By Bailey's 10th birthday, they had settled into the comfortable rhythm of old companions. Their walks were leisurely strolls now, with frequent stops to rest on the bench by the pond or to chat with neighbors. Bailey's muzzle had grown white, and he moved with the careful dignity of an elder statesman. Margaret, now 80, had slowed down too. Her children worried about her living alone, dropping hints about assisted living facilities and senior communities. But Margaret would have none of it. "Bailey and I are doing just fine," she'd tell them firmly. "We take care of each other." And they did. When Margaret's blood pressure medication made her dizzy, Bailey learned to walk beside her on the stairs, his solid body providing support. When Bailey's hips began to ache with arthritis, Margaret installed ramps over the porch steps and bought him an orthopedic bed that cost more than her own mattress. They had their routines down to an art. Morning pills for both of them, blood pressure and cholesterol for Margaret, arthritis and epilepsy medication for Bailey. Gentle stretches in the living room, Bailey mimicking Margaret's movements in his own canine way. Breakfast on the porch, when weather permitted, watching the birds at the feeders. Margaret's grandchildren loved to visit, and Bailey was endlessly patient with their attention. He'd let little Emma dress him in scarves and hats, sitting stoically while she declared him Princess Bailey. He'd retrieve tennis balls for teenage Jake until his legs trembled with exhaustion. And he had a special bond with Sarah's daughter Lily, who was autistic, and found comfort in burying her face in his soft fur. "He's not just a dog," Sarah observed during one visit watching Lily reading to Bailey under the oak tree. "He's like, I don't know, like an angel or something." Margaret smiled. "He's my guardian angel, that's for sure." The seasons continued their eternal dance, and Margaret and Bailey danced along with them. Spring gardens grew smaller but no less cherished. Summer afternoons were spent in the shade, Bailey's heavy panting keeping time with the cicadas. Autumn walks were measured in feet rather than miles, but the joy in Bailey's eyes as he snuffled through the fallen leaves remained unchanged. Winter meant more time indoors, curled up by the fireplace, Margaret knitting, while Bailey dozed and dreamed, his legs twitching as he chased rabbits in his sleep. The decline. The changes came gradually at first. Bailey began sleeping more, sometimes not even stirring when Margaret got up in the morning. His appetite, once voracious, became finicky. He'd pick at his food, turning his nose up at kibble he'd previously devoured. "Just getting older," Dr. Patterson said during a checkup. "Try adding some warm water to his food, maybe a little low-sodium chicken broth." But Margaret knew it was more than age. She saw it in the way Bailey struggled to stand after lying down, the way he sometimes seemed confused about where he was. There were accidents in the house, something that would have mortified the younger Bailey. Margaret never scolded him, just cleaned up quietly while Bailey looked on with ashamed eyes. "It's okay, sweet boy," she'd whisper, stroking his head. "We all get old." The seizures became more frequent despite medication adjustments. Margaret started sleeping on the couch to be closer to Bailey's bed, waking instantly when she heard the telltale sounds of an episode beginning. She'd sit on the floor beside him, speaking softly, timing the seizure, ready with the emergency medication if it lasted too long. Their walks became symbolic gestures, a slow shuffle to the mailbox and back. Bailey would pause frequently, his legs trembling, his breathing labored, but he insisted on going waiting by the door at the usual time, his cloudy eyes brightening when Margaret reached for his leash. The day Bailey couldn't make it back from the mailbox was a turning point. He simply sat down in the driveway, looked at Margaret with apologetic eyes, and couldn't go further. Margaret sat beside him on the cold asphalt, not caring about her arthritis, and they stayed there together until Tom Henderson drove by and helped them both into his truck. "Maybe it's time to think about," Tom began gently, but Margaret cut him off. "Not yet," she said firmly. "He'll tell me when it's time." Ducky, the last good day. 2 weeks before that final morning, they had what Margaret would later think of as their last perfect day. Bailey woke with unusual energy, actually getting up to greet Margaret instead of waiting for her to come to him. He ate his breakfast with something approaching his old enthusiasm and even managed a dignified wag when Jim delivered a package. "Hey, old boy's looking good today," Jim commented, giving Bailey his customary scratch. The October weather was glorious. Warm sun, cool breeze, the maple trees in full autumn splendor. Margaret decided to attempt their old walk route, or at least part of it. They made it past the Henderson farm, Bailey moving slowly but steadily, his nose working overtime to catch up on all the scents he'd missed. At the pond, their old bench beckoned. Margaret sat down gratefully, and Bailey surprised her by managing to hop up beside her, something he hadn't done in months. They sat together watching the geese prepare for their southern journey, the water reflecting the gold and crimson of the surrounding trees. "Remember when you used to chase those geese?" Margaret asked, and Bailey's tail thumped once in acknowledgement. "You never caught one, but oh, how you tried." An elderly couple walked by with their young Labrador puppy, and the puppy strained toward Bailey, all wiggling energy and curiosity. The old Bailey would have been delighted, but now he simply observed with gentle dignity, allowing the puppy to sniff him briefly before it was pulled away. "Beautiful dog," the woman said to Margaret. "How old?" 13. Margaret replied, her hand resting on Bailey's head. "That's a good long life for a golden," the man observed. "You've taken wonderful care of him. We've taken care of each other," Margaret said, the words catching in her throat. They made it home as the sun was setting, both exhausted but content. That evening, Bailey managed to climb onto the couch beside Margaret, another feat he hadn't accomplished in weeks. They watched an old movie together, Bailey's head heavy on Margaret's lap, her fingers gently stroking his ears. "I love you, Bailey boy," she whispered, and he responded with a deep sigh of contentment. That night she let him sleep in the bed with her rules be damned. He curled up against her side and Margaret fell asleep to the sound of his breathing, not knowing it would be the last time he'd have the strength to climb those stairs. The decision. The following days brought a rapid decline. Bailey stopped eating entirely, turning his head away even from his favorite treats. He could barely stand, and when he did, his back legs would give out. The light in his eyes, that spark that made Bailey who he was, began to fade. Dr. Patterson made a house call, kneeling beside Bailey's bed with practiced gentleness. Her examination was thorough but brief. She'd known Bailey too long to subject him to unnecessary poking and prodding. "His kidneys are failing," she said quietly, sitting back on her heels. "His body is shutting down. We could try IV fluids, maybe buy a few more days, but he'd be miserable," Margaret finished. "Yes, he's had a wonderful life, Margaret. 13 years is a gift. But his quality of life now." She didn't need to finish. Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "How long?" "He's not in acute pain, but he's uncomfortable, confused. I wouldn't wait more than a day or two. You'll know when it's time." That night Margaret slept on the floor beside Bailey's bed. She told him all the things she needed him to know. how he'd saved her life after Robert died, how he'd given her purpose and joy, how deeply and completely she loved him. Bailey listened, his breathing labored, but his eyes fixed on her face. "If you need to go," she whispered, "it's okay. I'll be okay. You've taught me how to be okay." But Bailey held on, and Margaret understood. He was waiting for her to be ready. He'd taken care of her for 13 years. He wouldn't leave until he knew she could let him go. Namaso, the last morning. Which brings us back to this morning. Margaret sitting at the kitchen table watching Bailey struggle with each breath. She'd made the call to Dr. Patterson an hour ago. This afternoon, she'd said, her voice steady, despite her breaking heart. "Can you come this afternoon?" Now in the quiet morning light, Margaret made a decision. If this was to be Bailey's last day, it would be a good one. She went to the refrigerator and pulled out the steak she'd been saving for her birthday. She cooked it on the stove, the smell filling the kitchen. Bailey's nose twitched, and for the first time in days he showed interest. She cut the steak into small pieces and hand-fed them to him, each bite a communion between old friends. He managed to eat half more than he'd eaten all week, his tail managing a weak wag of appreciation. "How about one more adventure?" she asked, and Bailey's ears perked up slightly at the familiar word. She brought his bed out to the porch, settling it in his favorite sunny spot. Then she sat beside him on the floor, her old bones protesting but ignored. Together they watched the world they'd shared for 13 years. The birds at the feeders, the Hendersons' cows in the distant pasture, the leaves falling like golden snow. Jim arrived with the mail, took one look at the scene and understood. He knelt beside Bailey, tears in his eyes. "You've been the best boy," he said roughly. "The very best boy." Throughout the morning, word seemed to spread through their small community. Tom Henderson stopped by, with his wife bringing the dog biscuits Bailey had always loved. The elderly couple from the pond walked over their puppy, notably absent. Even Margaret's mailbox-hitting teenager from down the street came by, mumbling an awkward goodbye. Sarah arrived just after noon, having driven up from Boston after Margaret's call. She sat with them on the porch, sharing stories of Bailey's younger days, laughing through her tears. "Remember when he stole the Thanksgiving turkey?" Sarah asked, and Margaret smiled at the memory. Bailey had grabbed the entire roasted bird off the counter while Margaret's back was turned, attempting to hide under the dining room table with his prize. The family had ended up ordering Chinese food and giving Bailey a stern lecture he completely ignored, too pleased with his bounty to care. "He was never sorry for that one," Margaret chuckled, stroking Bailey's head. "Not one bit." As the afternoon shadows grew long, Dr. Patterson's car pulled into the driveway. Margaret's heart clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "She's here, sweet boy. Your doctor's here." What happened next would stay with Margaret forever. Bailey, who hadn't been able to stand unassisted for days, somehow found the strength to get to his feet. He walked, slowly, painfully, but with determination, to his favorite spot under the oak tree. He circled once, twice, then lay down with a deep sigh, facing the house where he'd spent 13 happy years. "He's choosing his spot," Dr. Patterson said softly, her own eyes wet. "What a remarkable soul." Margaret knelt beside him, cradling his noble head in her lap. Sarah sat on his other side, her hand on his golden flank. Dr. Patterson prepared her supplies quietly, giving them time. "You've been the best friend I could have asked for," Margaret whispered to Bailey. "The very best. Robert is waiting for you. I know he is. He'll throw tennis balls for you all day long, and there will be endless steaks and no more pills. But don't forget me, okay? Save a spot for me." Bailey's tail managed one more wag, and he looked into Margaret's eyes with perfect clarity, all the love and devotion of 13 years shining through. Then he gave a small sigh and closed his eyes, ready. "Whenever you're ready," Dr. Patterson said gently. Margaret kissed Bailey's white muzzle. Okay, my sweet boy, you can go now. Go find Robert. Go run again. The injection was swift and painless. Bailey simply went to sleep deeper and more peaceful than any sleep before. His breathing slowed, then stopped, and the great heart that had beaten with such loyalty and love was still. Margaret held him for a long time, Sarah's arms around her, both of them crying for the passing of a soul too good for this world. Dr. Patterson waited patiently, understanding that this goodbye couldn't be rushed. As the sun set behind the oak tree painting the sky in shades of gold that matched Bailey's coat, Margaret finally stood. Her legs were stiff, her heart shattered, but somehow she felt a strange peace. Bailey had lived a full life. He had loved and been loved completely. He had gone gently surrounded by love in his favorite place. "Thank you," she whispered to the still form beneath the tree. "Thank you for 13 perfect years." After, Tom Henderson and his sons buried Bailey beneath the oak tree the next morning. Margaret had Sarah help her wrap him in his favorite blanket, the one he'd claimed as a puppy and dragged everywhere until it was more holes than fabric. She tucked his collar and his beloved tennis ball beside him. The house felt impossibly empty. Margaret found herself looking for Bailey everywhere, by her chair at the door for walks beside his food bowl. She caught herself saving bacon scraps and talking to the empty air. The silence was deafening. But slowly, with each passing day, the acute pain softened into a gentle ache. Margaret began to remember not just the end but the beginning, and all the wonderful middle. She smiled at the worn spot on the rug where Bailey always lay, laughed at the teeth marks on the kitchen table leg from his puppy days, treasured the nose prints on the window where he'd watched for her return. A month after Bailey's passing, Sarah arrived for a visit. "Mom, I have something for you," she said, pulling out a wrapped canvas. It was a painting of Bailey captured perfectly in his prime golden coat, shining eyes bright with intelligence and love. But what made Margaret gasp was the background. It showed their daily walk route, every detail perfect from the Henderson farm to the pond with its bench. "The artist worked from all those photos I took over the years," Sarah explained. I thought, well, I thought you should have this." Margaret hung the painting where she could see it from her chair. Sometimes she talked to it, telling Bailey about her day sharing the neighborhood news. It wasn't the same as his warm presence, but it helped. Winter came early that year, and Margaret's first snow without Bailey was hard. No golden form bounding through the drifts, no wet dog smell filling the kitchen as he dried by the stove. But as she stood at the window watching the snow fall, she saw tracks in the yard. A fox had passed through, followed by several rabbits and even a deer. It was as if the wildlife knew Bailey was gone and felt safe to explore. "You would have loved chasing them," she murmured, and almost felt she could hear his answering bark. On Christmas Eve, Margaret's whole family gathered at the farmhouse. The grandchildren were subdued, at first feeling Bailey's absence keenly. But as the evening wore on, stories began to flow. Remember when Bailey ate Emma's ice cream cone? Remember how he always knew when someone was sad? Remember his pure joy when anyone said the word walk? Late that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Margaret sat in Robert's old chair, the house quiet around her. She closed her eyes and could almost feel Bailey's weight against her legs, could almost hear his contented sighs. "I miss you both," she whispered to the darkness. "But I'm okay. You made sure I'd be okay." Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing Bailey's resting place beneath the oak tree. But Margaret knew that come spring flowers would grow there. She'd already ordered the daffodil bulbs, Bailey's favorite, to dig up. She'd plant them deep and surround them with stones, and when they bloomed, she'd sit on a new bench Tom Henderson had promised to build and tell Bailey all about them. Life would go on different, but still good, still worth living. Bailey had taught her that after Robert died, and his final gift was making sure she remembered the lesson. Love doesn't end with death. It transforms, becoming memory and gratitude, sorrow and joy intertwined. As Margaret climbed the stairs to bed, slowly, carefully, without her golden guardian beside her, she paused at the landing window. The moon had emerged from behind the clouds, illuminating the oak tree in silver light. For just a moment she could swear she saw two figures there, one tall and human-shaped, one lower to the ground with a wagging tail. Then she blinked, and there was only the tree standing sentinel in the night. "Good night, my boys," she whispered, and went to bed with a smile on her face. Bailey was gone, but love remained. Love always remained.